The grand hall glistened with golden lights that reflected off crystal chandeliers, casting a warm glow over the crowded space. People moved about in lavish attire, long gowns shimmering with sequins, and finely tailored suits that spoke of wealth and taste. Laughter and polished conversation filled the air, as guests greeted each other with practiced smiles, hands brushing expensive watches and gleaming jewelry. This was the type of evening where every detail seemed designed to impress, where every attendee appeared sculpted to fit the scene of luxury. Through the grand entrance walked an elderly black man. His presence was subtle, almost easy to miss. He wore a simple, outdated suit that seemed entirely out of place among the evening's extravagance. The fabric, though clean and pressed, held none of the sheen or style that filled the hall around him. His shoes, well kept but unpolished, made no grand impression, and his posture was quiet, almost humble. Yet there was something steady about him, something unbothered by the gleaming spectacle. Some of the guests noticed him as he walked through the crowd, and their reactions ranged from quiet chuckles to quick, whispered comments. Two young women dressed in glittering gowns exchanged looks, then broke into muffled giggles, their eyes tracing the lines of his modest suit as though it were a curiosity. He seemed unaware, or perhaps simply uninterested in the attention. His steps were slow and steady as he looked around, taking in the grandeur as if he were observing it for the first time. A man standing nearby leaned to his friend and whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Must have gotten lost on his way in. Or maybe he's just here for a free meal." They laughed quietly, nodding to each other as if their assumptions were confirmed. More guests glanced his way, their gazes curious and judgmental. The elderly man showed no sign of noticing. His calm, steady gaze moved across the room, pausing here and there as though he were admiring the setting rather than the people within it. As he moved further into the crowd, another pair, a wealthy couple dressed in matching designer outfits, caught sight of him. The woman, with a diamond necklace resting on her neck, turned to her husband with an amused smile. "Look at that suit," she murmured, a hint of condescension lacing her voice. "Do you think he's someone's driver who wandered in?" Her husband chuckled in response, their eyes following the elderly man as though he were an oddity. Still, he continued on, unaffected, his face showing nothing but quiet peace as he absorbed the room around him. He paused near a long, polished table filled with hors d'oeuvres and carefully arranged champagne glasses. Lifting a glass, he nodded politely to the waiter beside him, who looked surprised but said nothing. Guests nearby exchanged glances, some amused, others visibly curious. His quiet composure seemed to clash so thoroughly with the splendor around him that many couldn't resist watching. As he stood by the table, sipping his champagne in measured, unhurried sips, the elderly man's eyes quietly observed the people around him. He noticed the fine details of the event, the way the musicians played soft melodies in the background, the lavish arrangements of fresh flowers that scented the air, the laughter and chattering that bubbled over the music. Yet, there was a faint sense of distance in his gaze, as if he were not entirely part of the scene but merely a visitor passing through. A younger man, tall and fashionably dressed, caught sight of him and sauntered over, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening, sir," he said smoothly, his tone laced with an undercurrent of amusement. "Nice to see someone enjoying the champagne as much as the rest of us." He gave a quick, sweeping glance at the elderly man's suit, the lines around his mouth tightening as if he were holding back a laugh. "Quite the event, isn't it?" The elderly man returned the smile, polite and mild. "It's a lovely evening," he replied, his voice steady and calm. There was no hint of discomfort or embarrassment, only a quiet confidence that made the younger man's smirk waver for a split second. The older man didn't seem affected by the silent judgment that filled the younger man's gaze. In fact, his response was so dignified that it seemed to unsettle the young man just slightly. The younger man quickly regained his composure, chuckling as if to regain the upper hand. "I must say, I didn't expect to see anyone dressed so uniquely," he added, his tone carrying a hint of condescension that he thought was subtle but wasn't. He gestured around, his hand sweeping over the finely dressed guests as if to emphasize the contrast. But then again, I suppose we all bring our own style to events like this. He smiled, expecting the elderly man to feel the sting of his words. But the elderly man simply nodded, unbothered. "Style is indeed a personal choice," he replied, his gaze steady and calm, his voice carrying a depth and sincerity that caught the younger man off guard. "I've always found that the finer things in life are more than just appearances." His words hung in the air, leaving the young man momentarily speechless. The younger man's face flushed, clearly surprised by the elderly man's unaffected demeanor. He stammered a bit, mumbling a quick farewell before moving on, clearly unsettled. The older man simply watched him go, his face unchanging, a hint of knowing warmth in his eyes. It was as though he could see beyond the young man's smug exterior and found nothing worthy of resentment or anger. A few other guests noticed the brief exchange. Their curiosity piqued as they wondered at the elderly man's calmness. One older woman nearby, her eyes filled with curiosity, observed him thoughtfully. Something about his presence made her pause, as though she sensed there was more to this quiet man than met the eye. He returned her gaze with a gentle nod, and in that moment she saw something in his eyes, a quiet wisdom, a depth of experience that she couldn't quite place but which made her think twice before dismissing him. Around him, the quiet hum of whispers began again, as guests murmured about the stranger who didn't seem to fit in yet carried himself with such grace. He seemed unshaken, almost amused by their stares, as though he held a secret they couldn't begin to guess. The curiosity surrounding him grew, each glance lingering just a little longer, each whisper a bit louder. Just as the murmurs started to grow, the venue's hostess, a tall, elegant woman with a sparkling gown and an air of effortless authority, caught sight of the elderly man. She moved toward him with purpose, her expression polite but with a hint of restrained curiosity. The guests noticed her approach and exchanged curious glances, eager to see what would unfold. With a gracious smile, she extended a hand to him. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and practiced, her eyes discreetly taking in his suit. "I hope you're enjoying yourself tonight. It's such a pleasure to have everyone here." There was a faint hesitation in her tone, a moment where she stumbled ever so slightly, as though struggling to find the right words. Her smile remained, but it was clear that his presence puzzled her, as if she were trying to place him but couldn't. The elderly man took her hand, giving it a polite shake. "It's a beautiful event," he replied warmly, his voice carrying the same calm confidence. He glanced around at the decor and the guests, then back at her. "You've put a lot of work into this. It shows." The hostess seemed taken aback by his sincere compliment, not quite expecting such an appreciative response. Recovering quickly, she nodded, her practiced smile returning. "Yes, well, we do strive to make these gatherings memorable." Her gaze flicked once more to his attire, curiosity getting the better of her. She hesitated, then added with a polite tilt of her head, "Forgive me, but I don't believe I caught your name. Are you here with one of our guests?" The elderly man's eyes held a glimmer of amusement as he met her gaze. "Just here on my own," he replied simply. "Wanted to see what all the excitement was about." The hostess raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but uncertain. "Well, we're glad you could join us. It's always refreshing to have new faces at these events." Her words were tactful, yet her underlying confusion was apparent to anyone observing. To her, he was an enigma, a guest who didn't quite fit yet carried himself with such quiet dignity that it was hard to dismiss him entirely. Before she could probe further, another guest, a wealthy businessman with a gleaming watch and a loud voice, approached them, greeting the hostess with a hearty laugh. "Ah, these events keep getting more extravagant every year," he exclaimed, then glanced at the elderly man with a raised eyebrow, as if unsure why he was part of their conversation. The hostess, slightly flustered by the interruption, quickly turned to the businessman, but the man's attention had already shifted back to the elderly gentleman. "Haven't seen you around before. Friend of the family?" he asked, his tone friendly yet laced with a hint of doubt, as though he were still trying to place the man within his social framework. The elderly man simply shook his head, offering a gentle smile. "Just enjoying the evening," he replied. His calm response seemed to baffle the businessman, who chuckled awkwardly, then turned to the hostess with a look that suggested he wanted to be filled in on who this stranger was. The hostess gave the elderly man a polite nod, signaling the end of their exchange, then led the businessman away, their voices fading into the crowd. But as they moved, the businessman couldn't resist a few backward glances, clearly unsettled by the interaction. The elderly man remained in his spot, quietly watching the room, his expression as composed as ever. Around him, the guests began to take even greater notice of him. Whispers drifted through the air, a mix of curiosity and judgment. The elderly man seemed unfazed, standing quietly with an air of patience, as though he were simply waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for everyone else to catch up to a truth they hadn't yet realized. The crowd continued their curious stares, each wondering who he was and why he, of all people, seemed so unaffected by the judgment around him. As the elderly man continued to observe the bustling crowd, he caught the eye of a young server who seemed nervous and out of place herself. She was struggling to balance a tray of hors d'oeuvres, weaving through clusters of guests who barely noticed her. Her gaze darted around the room anxiously, and just as she neared the elderly man, a guest abruptly stepped back, colliding with her and knocking the tray out of her hands. The tray clattered to the ground, sending small plates scattering and food spilling across the polished floor. The young woman's face went pale, her hands shaking as she began to stammer apologies to the nearby guests who had turned to look, some with irritation, others with mild amusement. She bent down quickly, trying to gather the fallen plates, her face growing redder by the second as the murmurs around her grew louder. The elderly man knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her arm to steady her. "Here, let me help you," he said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. His kind eyes met hers, and he offered her a warm smile that seemed to melt away her anxiety. She looked at him with surprise, clearly not expecting anyone to help, especially not a guest. With his assistance, they began to pick up the plates together, the elderly man moving with unhurried patience, as though the mess on the floor was of no consequence. As they worked side by side, she murmured a quiet, "Thank you, sir," her eyes filled with gratitude. The kindness in his expression softened her tension, and slowly, she began to breathe more easily. One of the guests nearby scoffed quietly, nudging his companion and murmuring under his breath, "Look at him. He's as out of place as the servers here, might as well put him to work, too." His companion chuckled, and the two of them continued watching, amused by the sight of the elderly man kneeling on the floor, assisting the young server. Yet the elderly man seemed untouched by their judgment. He finished picking up the plates, handing them back to the young woman with a reassuring nod. "Don't worry," he said kindly. "Everyone makes mistakes. Just remember to take things one step at a time. You'll be fine." She gave him a grateful smile, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Thank you, sir," she whispered again, genuinely moved by his gesture. She picked up the tray, and with a quiet nod disappeared into the crowd, her step steadier now, her confidence slightly restored. The elderly man stood, brushing off his hands, and resumed his quiet presence among the guests. Those who had witnessed the exchange looked on with mixed expressions, some puzzled, others intrigued, but most just dismissive. In their eyes, his willingness to stoop down and help a mere server only confirmed his unsuitability for an event of such grandeur. But to him, it was nothing more than a simple act of kindness. His calm, unassuming demeanor persisted, and if he noticed the stares and murmurs that followed him, he gave no indication. Instead, he continued to observe the room with a quiet patience, as if he were seeing something beyond the lavish display around him, something that only he understood. As the elderly man resumed his quiet observation of the gala, his eyes seemed to take in each detail, lingering on the lavish decorations, the gleaming crystal chandeliers, the elegant arrangements. He had a look of appreciation, as though he were admiring not just the beauty, but the effort and craftsmanship behind every piece. However, others in the crowd continued to notice him, their reactions a mix of amusement and discomfort, the whispers and glances more frequent now, as he moved gracefully through the room. Just then, the hostess reappeared, accompanied by a wealthy older man with a gleaming watch and an air of authority. The hostess gestured discreetly toward the elderly man, and the two exchanged curious glances. After a brief exchange, the wealthy man approached him with a broad, practiced smile, extending a hand. "Good evening," he said in a voice that held a hint of polite condescension. "I couldn't help but notice you enjoying yourself here tonight." The elderly man returned the handshake with the same polite warmth, his grip steady, his face calm. "It is a beautiful event," he replied simply, his gaze meeting the other man's without a trace of discomfort or apology. The wealthy man chuckled, his eyes gleaming with a hint of amusement. "And do you often attend gatherings like this? I mean, events of this caliber?" He tilted his head slightly, the question hanging between them, its intent thinly veiled. A few other guests had gathered nearby, their eyes fixed on the exchange, eager to see how this stranger would respond. With a small, untroubled smile, the elderly man responded, "I try to attend when I can. It's always interesting to see how people come together, especially for occasions as grand as this." His tone was calm, his words gracious, and his expression genuine. There was no hint of defensiveness or awkwardness, only a quiet dignity that left the onlookers intrigued. The wealthy man's smile faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly, casting a quick glance at the hostess, who stood nearby, watching with curiosity. She too was taken aback by the elderly man's calm response, which seemed far too composed for someone supposedly out of place. A faint discomfort settled over the group, as though the expected dynamic, one of power and intimidation, had somehow shifted, leaving them unsure of how to proceed. To fill the awkward silence, the wealthy man cleared his throat and attempted another line of inquiry. "And do you have any connections with our hosts this evening?" he asked, gesturing broadly at the opulent setting. "Perhaps you're a guest of one of the sponsors?" The elderly man shook his head, his gaze drifting momentarily around the room. "No, I'm here on my own," he answered simply, his tone steady. He added with a slight smile, "Just thought I'd come and enjoy the evening. I find these gatherings to be quite illuminating." His words were sincere, yet his choice of the word illuminating seemed to carry a weight that went unnoticed by most, though a few onlookers caught the subtle hint and exchanged puzzled looks. At that moment, a tall, well-dressed young man joined the group, noticing the ongoing conversation. He regarded the elderly man with a curious smile, extending his hand as though to welcome him into their social circle. "It's always a pleasure to meet someone with such an appreciation for events like these," he remarked with a friendly tone that barely masked his condescension. "I'm curious, though. It's not often we see someone with your unique sense of style at a gathering like this." His gaze drifted to the elderly man's suit, a slight smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. But the elderly man merely smiled back, unshaken by the young man's thinly veiled comment. "Yes, I suppose I have my own preferences," he replied smoothly, the light in his eyes hinting at an awareness that his choice of attire was causing quite the stir. He glanced at the young man's impeccably tailored suit and added, "But I think true appreciation comes from more than just appearance. Don't you agree?" The young man's expression faltered, his smirk fading as he found himself without a quick response. The elderly man's gentle yet pointed words had taken him by surprise, leaving him momentarily unsure of himself. The other guests, watching this quiet exchange, sensed something beyond the surface, a subtle but undeniable power in the elderly man's calm demeanor that left them intrigued, perhaps even slightly unsettled. Without waiting for a reply, the elderly man offered a small nod and stepped away, leaving the group standing in his wake, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. His calm, dignified presence lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the interaction, each of them wondering just who this man could be. As he moved through the room, the whispers around him grew louder, his mysterious identity becoming the subject of speculation and intrigue, drawing more attention with each passing moment. As the evening progressed, the murmurs and whispers surrounding the elderly man only grew, filling the hall like an undercurrent of tension. People continued to steal glances, their curiosity blending with judgment as they watched him move quietly from one area to another. Meanwhile, a few staff members subtly acknowledged him with respectful nods, offering smiles that seemed warmer and more genuine than the polite yet hollow greetings they gave to the other guests. One of the servers, a young man balancing a tray of drinks, made eye contact with the elderly man and gave a respectful nod, a hint of recognition in his eyes. Unlike the guests, he seemed aware of who the man truly was, or at least aware enough to show him the kind of respect that few others in the room extended. This small, unspoken interaction only deepened the mystery around the elderly man, sparking further curiosity in those who witnessed it. A woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed and carrying herself with an air of authority, watched this exchange closely, her brows knitting together in puzzlement. She leaned over to her husband, who was equally well-dressed and engrossed in conversation, and whispered, "Did you see that?" The staff seemed to know him. But who on earth could he be? Her husband shrugged dismissively, more interested in discussing business deals with his colleagues than entertaining her curiosity. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the elderly man than met the eye. Determined to satisfy her curiosity, she made her way over to a nearby staff member who had just finished serving a round of appetizers. "Excuse me," she began, her voice polite but insistent. "Do you happen to know that man over there?" She gestured discreetly toward the elderly man, who was now examining a piece of art on the wall with quiet appreciation. The staff member hesitated, glancing toward the elderly man before replying with a neutral smile. "I'm afraid I don't know him personally, ma'am," he said carefully, choosing his words with caution. "But I can tell you that he's well respected here." His tone held a hint of reverence that did not go unnoticed, and the woman's curiosity only grew, now tinged with a slight discomfort. Meanwhile, the elderly man moved along to another part of the room, pausing by a large table where several prominent figures were engaged in conversation. One of them, an older gentleman with an air of wealth and influence, noticed him and raised a skeptical eyebrow as though sizing him up. "Interesting attire for an event like this," the man commented, his voice just loud enough for those around him to hear, his words dripping with subtle disdain. The elderly man turned to him, his calm expression unchanged. "Interesting people, too," he replied, his voice soft but carrying a note of irony that lingered in the air. His gaze held steady, meeting the older gentleman's eyes without a trace of intimidation or anger, but rather with a quiet strength that seemed to speak volumes. The older gentleman stiffened, caught off guard by the response, while a few other guests nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A young woman standing beside the elderly man observed the interaction with a curious expression, clearly taken by his unflinching confidence. The exchange left a peculiar silence in its wake, as if the atmosphere had shifted slightly, unsettling those who had assumed their social standing granted them a higher place. The elderly man continued to look around with a quiet air of appreciation, pausing here and there to observe a painting or sculpture. His actions were unhurried, as though he were savoring the moment, unconcerned with the glances and whispers that followed him. For those watching, his every move only added to the growing mystery, each interaction further hinting that he was no ordinary guest. They couldn't place him, couldn't fit him neatly into their world of wealth and status, and that made them uneasy. In the midst of their confusion, a quiet respect began to grow, mingling with their curiosity. As the whispers continued to ripple through the crowd, a soft murmur of excitement suddenly filled the room. The hostess appeared on stage, tapping a glass with a spoon to capture everyone's attention. Guests gradually quieted, turning their focus to her, intrigued by the unexpected announcement. She smiled warmly, holding the microphone with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and polished, "thank you all for joining us tonight. We are truly honored to have such a distinguished gathering." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not only the success of our esteemed guests, but also the legacy of this beautiful venue, a symbol of resilience, perseverance, and quiet strength." The elderly man, who stood toward the back of the room, watched with mild interest as the hostess spoke. She continued, "It's easy to take a place like this for granted, to forget the story behind these walls. This venue has a history of transformation, of rising above challenges, and serving as a place where people come together to make memories, form connections, and celebrate life." There was a brief pause as the crowd took in her words, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging interested glances. The elderly man's expression softened, his gaze momentarily drifting as if he were lost in thought, perhaps remembering a past deeply tied to the place they now stood in. Just then, one of the servers discreetly approached the elderly man and handed him a small note with a respectful bow. The gesture was subtle, yet a few nearby guests noticed. Their curiosity piqued. The elderly man unfolded the note quietly, glancing at its contents, and then nodded thoughtfully, tucking the paper away in his jacket pocket. As the hostess continued speaking, some of the guests noticed this small exchange and couldn't help but wonder who he was. They exchanged whispered theories, each one sounding less plausible than the last. Their curiosity had grown into a collective fascination, a mix of admiration and unease for this mysterious man, who seemed to move through the evening with such quiet authority, untouched by the social games that surrounded him. The hostess, still addressing the crowd, announced with a smile, "Now, to further honor this legacy, we have a special guest with us tonight, someone who understands the true value of resilience and who has helped preserve this beautiful venue over the years." Guests turned to each other in surprise, intrigued by this unexpected revelation. Murmurs spread like wildfire, each person guessing who this mystery guest might be. Some speculated it was a local philanthropist. Others believed it might be a wealthy benefactor they hadn't met yet. All eyes darted around the room, each person eager to spot the face behind this new mystery. The elderly man, meanwhile, stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on the stage. He appeared unbothered by the attention surrounding him, as if he were quietly enjoying the moment, watching as the evening unfolded exactly as he had anticipated. The guests who had mocked him earlier felt a subtle shift in their own perceptions, each wondering if they had overlooked something, if perhaps they had misjudged the man who seemed so at ease amidst the splendor. The air grew tense with anticipation as the hostess looked around the room, her eyes scanning the guests before settling at last on the elderly man standing in the back. With a knowing smile, she gestured toward him, her voice ringing clear over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her tone warm with respect, "please join me in welcoming the man who has made all of this possible, the true owner of this remarkable venue, a man whose legacy lives in every corner of this beautiful hall." The room fell silent, stunned as all eyes turned toward the elderly man. The room fell into a stunned silence as the hostess's words echoed through the hall, each syllable landing like a gentle thunderbolt in the minds of the onlookers. The elderly man stood at the back, his expression calm and unchanged, as if he had anticipated this very moment. All eyes were now fixed on him, and the air was thick with a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and a growing sense of respect that hadn't been there moments before. Some of the guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, others shifted uncomfortably, realizing with a pang of guilt that they had misjudged him so completely. The wealthy businessman, who had earlier tried to probe into the man's connections, stood frozen, his confident demeanor now replaced by a look of shock. He had laughed, condescended, and dismissed the elderly man based solely on his appearance, and now he was face to face with the truth of his own arrogance. The hostess, still smiling warmly, gestured for the elderly man to step forward. At first he hesitated, his humble nature evident in the way he remained at the edge of the crowd, as though reluctant to take center stage. But then, with a slight nod and a gracious smile, he began to make his way through the room. The crowd parted naturally for him, each person stepping back to give him space, their gazes filled with a mixture of awe and apology. As he walked, the murmur of whispers filled the air, each guest sharing their astonishment in hushed voices. "He owns this place," one woman whispered, her face a mixture of wonder and regret. "I can't believe it. We all thought he didn't belong here." The young server he had helped earlier caught his eye and offered a small, grateful smile, her expression one of quiet pride, as though she had known all along that he was someone remarkable. He gave her a slight nod in return, acknowledging her kindness, a kindness shown when she knew nothing of his status or wealth, simply a kindness given to a stranger in need. This silent exchange was not lost on the surrounding guests, who now saw in him a man of true character, a man who, despite his quiet presence, had left a profound impact on everyone he had encountered. As he reached the front, he stood beside the hostess, who handed him the microphone with a respectful bow of her head. He took it gently, his fingers brushing the cool metal, and looked out at the crowd. A sea of faces, each one humbled, each one waiting, each one eager to hear the words of the man they had dismissed just moments before. He cleared his throat, and his voice, though soft, filled the room with a quiet strength that commanded attention. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting the gazes of those who had laughed, those who had whispered, and those who had shown kindness. "Thank you all for being here tonight and for supporting this place that holds so many memories, so much history. I am deeply grateful." He paused, letting his words settle over the room, and then continued. "I know that some of you may have wondered why I would come here dressed as I am, why I would choose to wear a simple suit to a grand event like this. The truth is, I have always believed that what we wear does not define us. I've worn fine clothes and I've worn modest ones, but neither has ever changed who I am or what I value." A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd as his words reached each listener, piercing through their assumptions and judgments, leaving them with the raw truth of his character. He smiled slightly, the lines on his face softening. "This venue, this place, has been a part of my life for many years. It was once a small building, barely noticed, and through hard work, through the efforts of so many who have come and gone, it became what it is today. To me, it isn't just a building. It's a symbol of growth, of resilience, and of the beauty that can come from humble beginnings." As he spoke, a quiet reverence filled the room, the guests hanging on to his every word, each one struck by the simplicity and power of his message. He looked at the young people, the wealthy businessmen, the elegant women, all those who had judged him, and his gaze held no anger or resentment. Instead, there was only understanding, a wisdom that seemed to flow from a lifetime of experiences that he carried with grace. "One of the greatest lessons I've learned," he continued, his voice a gentle yet steady force, "is that true worth is never measured by what you wear, but by how you treat others, by how you carry yourself, by how you lift those around you. Tonight I am honored to be in the presence of so many wonderful people who have come together to celebrate, and I hope that as you enjoy this evening, you will remember that kindness, humility, and respect are the finest things any of us can possess." The guests stood in silence, moved by his words, their earlier judgments forgotten, replaced by a newfound respect and admiration. The room remained silent, the guests caught in the quiet power of his words, each one reflecting on the truths he had so calmly revealed. The elderly man stood there, composed, letting his message settle over the crowd, his gaze unwavering yet gentle. In that moment, he was not just the owner of the venue, but a figure who commanded respect through his very presence. The weight of his wisdom, gained over years of hard work and perseverance, seemed to fill every corner of the hall, pressing upon each person's heart with an undeniable force. A few guests, previously so eager to dismiss him, looked down in subtle shame, their faces tinged with regret for their earlier behavior. The wealthy businessman who had mocked him earlier was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other, as if the spotlight of his own conscience shone upon him. He seemed to realize that, despite all his wealth, he lacked the quiet strength and humility radiating from the elderly man who had needed no grand attire to make his presence felt. The hostess, standing beside him, took a deep breath, visibly moved herself. She turned to the elderly man with genuine admiration, then looked out over the guests with a new sense of purpose. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly wavering with emotion. "Thank you for reminding us of the values that truly matter. Tonight is about more than just an event. It's about celebrating the spirit that this venue represents, a spirit you have embodied so beautifully." The elderly man nodded graciously, then handed the microphone back to her, stepping aside with a quiet dignity that only seemed to elevate him further in the eyes of everyone present. As he moved away from the stage, a ripple of applause began, growing steadily until the entire room was clapping, some even cheering softly. It wasn't the kind of applause reserved for a performer or a speech. It was a genuine outpouring of respect, a tribute to a man who had reminded them of something simple yet profound. He smiled faintly, acknowledging the applause with a gentle nod, but didn't linger in the limelight. Instead, he slipped back into the crowd, his steps unhurried, once again blending with the room, as if he were just another guest among them. The applause eventually faded, yet the impact of his presence lingered, like an unspoken promise to carry the lessons he had imparted. As he moved through the room, some of the guests approached him quietly, one by one, to offer their thanks or words of apology. The woman who had earlier questioned the server about him now stepped forward, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and sincerity. I want to apologize," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I made assumptions. I judged without knowing. I hope you can forgive my thoughtlessness." The elderly man looked at her with a gentle smile, his eyes filled with understanding. "We are all learning," he replied kindly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It takes courage to acknowledge our mistakes. I appreciate your honesty." His words seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders, and she nodded, gratitude evident in her expression as she stepped back, her head bowed in respect. More guests followed, each seeking a moment to speak with him, to express their admiration or to apologize for their initial impressions. To each one, he responded with the same quiet kindness, his words encouraging, his demeanor forgiving. There was no hint of superiority in his responses, only a deep empathy that came from having walked the path of life with grace and humility. As the evening continued, the energy in the room shifted completely. Where once there had been judgments and shallow assessments, there was now a sense of community, a shared experience that had transformed the gathering into something far deeper than anyone had expected. The guests lingered, no longer driven by appearances or status, but by a genuine desire to connect with one another, to honor the man who had reminded them of what truly mattered. As the evening wore on, the elderly man continued to circulate quietly among the guests, engaging in brief yet meaningful conversations with those who approached him. Each exchange was sincere, filled with a warmth that left people visibly touched, as though he had offered them a gift that couldn't be measured in material terms. Even those who had been too proud or hesitant to approach him watched from a distance, their expressions softened by the humility he radiated. Gradually, the focus of the evening began to shift. Guests who had come to flaunt their wealth or make business connections now found themselves drawn into deeper discussions. Groups formed around tables, where people shared stories of their own struggles and triumphs, reflecting on moments of vulnerability that they might never have spoken about otherwise. The elderly man's presence had woven a new atmosphere into the gathering, one that encouraged authenticity over appearances, connection over status. At one table, a young woman dressed in an elegant evening gown listened intently as the elderly man shared a story from his past. "There was a time," he said softly, "when I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a hope that was sometimes hard to hold on to. I worked as a laborer, often with barely enough to eat, but I held on to my dream. I saved every penny, invested every ounce of effort I could, even on the days when it felt impossible." The young woman's eyes widened, her earlier sense of privilege slowly dissolving as she listened. "How did you manage to stay hopeful?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him with a respect she hadn't felt for anyone before tonight, realizing the depth of his journey. The elderly man smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. I reminded myself that every step, every hardship was shaping me. I may not have had fine things, but I learned the value of perseverance, the strength of a kind word, and the power of patience. Those were my riches, long before I could afford a place like this. His words resonated deeply with her, and for the first time, she saw wealth as something far beyond possessions. Nearby, a group of businessmen who had once been focused on comparing stock portfolios now found themselves captivated by his quiet wisdom. One of them, a man in his 50s with an air of authority, leaned forward, his voice filled with a newfound respect. "You built all of this from nothing?" he asked, gesturing subtly around the room, his tone almost reverent. The elderly man nodded, his expression unchanging. "It took many years and many sacrifices, but every step taught me something. I learned to value people over profits, to trust those who were loyal, and to give back when I could." He paused, looking around the room. "A place like this is not built on money alone. It's built on the kindness of those who believe in something greater than themselves." The businessmen exchanged thoughtful glances, his words settling over them like a gentle rebuke, a reminder that their pursuit of wealth was empty without integrity and empathy. They had come to the gala to display their success, but now they were questioning what that success truly meant. At another corner of the room, the young server he had helped earlier observed him from afar, a grateful smile lighting up her face. She remembered the way he had knelt down without hesitation to help her, the way he had spoken to her as if she mattered. Inspired, she approached a group of fellow servers who were watching the event from the sidelines, their eyes filled with admiration. "That man," she whispered to them, her voice filled with awe. "He's not just rich. He's different. He cares about people, even those of us who serve." Her words struck a chord with the others, who nodded, each of them inspired by the man who had shown them that kindness could come from the most unexpected sources. The hostess, who had watched these transformations unfold, approached him once more, her face reflecting a mix of gratitude and wonder. "You've done something remarkable tonight," she said softly. "I've hosted many events here, but I've never seen anything like this. You've brought out the best in people. You've reminded us all of what truly matters." The elderly man nodded thoughtfully. "People often need just a small nudge to remember what they already know in their hearts," he replied. "The world may teach us to value wealth and status, but our spirits know better. Tonight I only reminded them of what they already carry within." As they spoke, the energy in the room became palpable, a collective sense of purpose and reflection that connected everyone in a shared understanding. The gala had transformed into something far more meaningful than any of them had anticipated. It had become a night of insight, where each person had the opportunity to look inward and assess the values that guided their lives. Around the room, guests began to make subtle gestures that reflected their newfound perspectives. A wealthy couple, who had earlier snubbed the servers, began thanking them with genuine smiles, even offering tips and kind words. A young man, previously absorbed in his phone, put it away and joined in a conversation with his peers, eager to share and listen. The wealthy businessman, once so full of pride, now spoke softly with his wife, his expression more humble than anyone had ever seen. The elderly man watched these interactions, his face calm, a gentle satisfaction in his eyes. He hadn't come to the gala for recognition or validation. He had come simply to be part of the world he had helped create, to witness the lives that flourished within these walls. And in doing so, he had reminded them all, without grandeur, without fanfare, that the real measure of a person lay not in what they owned, but in how they treated others. As the night deepened, the guests continued to converse, lingering longer than they had planned, each reluctant to leave, each carrying with them a part of the lesson he had imparted. And the elderly man, satisfied, moved quietly to the back of the room, slipping into the shadows with the same humility that had marked his entrance. His heart filled not with pride, but with a quiet joy for the change he had witnessed. As the evening drew closer to its end, the guests continued to bask in the unexpected warmth that had spread through the room, each one savoring the new connections they had formed and the lingering sense of purpose inspired by the elderly man's words. People who had previously seen one another as rivals or mere acquaintances were now engaged in heartfelt conversations, sharing stories of resilience, family, and dreams. The walls of status and judgment had dissolved, leaving behind only a sense of community, bound by a shared understanding of what truly mattered. The elderly man moved quietly among them, still watching with that same calm presence, as though he were observing the fruit of a seed planted long ago. He didn't seek attention, but the guests continued to acknowledge him with nods, smiles, and occasional words of thanks. Each encounter left them with a renewed feeling of respect, not only for him, but for the values he embodied. One young man, who had spent much of the night caught up in his own image, now found himself compelled to approach the elderly man. With a mixture of admiration and humility, he extended his hand. "Sir," he began, his voice a bit unsteady, I think I owe you an apology. Earlier tonight I made assumptions about you. I thought that I knew who belonged here and who didn't, but I was wrong." The elderly man regarded him kindly, accepting his hand in a warm grasp. "We're all here to learn, my friend," he replied gently. "None of us are beyond making mistakes. What matters is how we grow from them." The young man nodded, visibly moved by the response. He withdrew his hand, giving a grateful nod before stepping back, his face transformed with newfound respect. A short distance away, the hostess observed this exchange, her heart swelling with pride for the unexpected turn her event had taken. This gathering had been planned as a night of elegance, a display of wealth and success, but it had become something far deeper, something intangible and profound. She realized that the evening would be remembered not for the decorations or the guest list, but for the quiet lessons imparted by a man whose presence had shifted the very soul of the night. With this realization, she took to the microphone one last time, her voice soft but clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, drawing the attention of the crowd, "thank you again for joining us tonight. I think we can all agree that this has become a truly memorable evening, one we will carry with us for years to come." She paused, her gaze moving to the elderly man, her expression filled with gratitude. "I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to someone who has given us all a gift tonight, a reminder of the values that make us human. In a world that often measures success by wealth and status, he has shown us that true success is found in humility, kindness, and the connections we create with one another." The guests turned to the elderly man, their eyes filled with a quiet reverence. The applause began slowly, then grew steadily, filling the room with a genuine appreciation that words could not express. It was not the applause of admiration for wealth or achievement. It was the applause of respect for a man who had changed them without ever seeking to. The elderly man inclined his head, a gentle smile on his face. He didn't raise his hand to wave, didn't bask in the applause. He simply stood with a modesty that matched the quiet power he had displayed throughout the evening. And in that simple, unassuming moment, he left them with one final lesson: that sometimes the most extraordinary people are those who seek nothing for themselves, who lead with grace and wisdom, and who lift others up by simply being who they are. As the applause softened, people began to approach him again, eager for just a few last words, a handshake, a smile. And he welcomed them all, giving each person his full attention, as if every interaction were a gift to be treasured. The night lingered on, as people clung to the atmosphere he had created, reluctant to let go of the peace and warmth that now enveloped the room. In the final moments, as guests began to take their leave, each left with a feeling they hadn't anticipated, a sense of contentment, a deeper appreciation for the people around them, and a quiet promise to carry the lessons of this night forward. and as the elderly man watched them go, his heart was filled with a humble satisfaction, knowing that he had given them something far more lasting than a grand celebration. He had given them a piece of himself, a piece that would live on in the hearts of all who had been there that night. As the last few guests lingered in the hall, reluctant to part from the evening's warmth, the elderly man quietly made his way toward the exit. The crowd had thinned, leaving behind only a handful of people who were either deep in conversation or reflecting silently on the night's events. Some guests who noticed him moving toward the door watched with mixed emotions, admiration, respect, even a touch of wistfulness, knowing they had witnessed something rare and transformative. One of the remaining guests, a woman who had arrived with an air of superiority, suddenly felt compelled to approach him. She had been one of those who had initially cast judgment, her glances filled with disdain, but now her expression was softened, her pride humbled. As he neared the exit, she stepped forward, her posture tentative. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice laced with humility. He paused and turned to face her, his gentle expression encouraging her to speak. "I wanted to thank you, and to apologize. I know that I was wrong to make assumptions about you. Tonight has taught me more than I could have imagined." The elderly man gave her a warm smile, his gaze kind yet piercing, as if he could see her regret and respect intertwined. "It's never too late to learn," he replied gently. "The most important journey we can take is the one that teaches us to see others beyond what we assume. I appreciate your honesty." She nodded, visibly moved, her expression softened with gratitude. The interaction left her with a new sense of self-awareness, a quiet promise to herself that she would carry this lesson forward. As the elderly man resumed his walk to the door, the young server he had helped earlier appeared at his side, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to give you something. It's not much, but it's a small token of my gratitude." She extended the bundle toward him, her hands slightly trembling with nervousness and respect. He looked at her with a gentle smile, accepting the gift with a nod of appreciation. Unwrapping it slowly, he found a small, hand-stitched cloth, a simple yet heartfelt creation. It was decorated with intricate patterns, symbols of her culture and heritage, stitched with care and pride. "This is beautiful," he said softly, tracing the delicate stitching with his fingertips. "Thank you. It means a great deal to me." His words were sincere, and the young server beamed, her eyes shining with pride. For her, this small gesture felt like a way to give back a part of what he had given her, a sense of worth, a reminder that kindness and respect were not tied to status. With a gentle nod, he tucked the cloth carefully into his pocket, holding it close as he continued toward the door. The final guests looked on, some whispering to each other about the quiet exchange, touched by the humility of a man who accepted every gesture with the same grace he extended to others. As he reached the doorway, he turned back to take one last look at the grand hall, now nearly empty. In his eyes was a trace of nostalgia, a deep appreciation for the memories and moments that had unfolded within those walls. To anyone watching, it was clear that he was not merely leaving an event. He was leaving behind a legacy, a piece of himself in the lives he had touched. And with that, he stepped outside into the cool night air, his heart content knowing that the lessons he had imparted tonight would live on, not just in this building, but in the minds and hearts of everyone who had been present. The doors closed behind him, but his presence lingered, like an unspoken promise that the world could be a kinder, more understanding place. As he stepped into the night, the cool air washed over him, crisp and refreshing, a quiet contrast to the warmth and intensity of the evening. The street was peaceful, the distant hum of the city softened under the blanket of stars above. He took a deep breath, his gaze lifting to the night sky, the weight of the evening settling within him like a gentle reassurance. Though he hadn't come to make a statement, he knew tonight had sparked something profound, not only in those guests, but in himself as well. Just as he was about to make his way down the steps, he heard a voice call out from behind him. Turning, he saw the young server who had given him the cloth, now hurrying to catch up with him. Her face was flushed, and she looked slightly out of breath, her expression a mixture of urgency and gratitude. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet yet filled with a deep sincerity. "I know you've already done so much, but I couldn't let you leave without telling you what tonight has meant to me." He regarded her kindly, his expression inviting her to continue. She hesitated, gathering her thoughts, as though she were about to share something she hadn't shared with anyone before. I come from a place where people don't always believe in themselves," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Most of us feel invisible, like no one would notice if we disappeared. But tonight, you noticed me. You treated me like I mattered, like I was someone important." Her eyes shone with a mixture of pride and vulnerability. He listened with quiet intensity, each word deepening his understanding of the impact his actions had made. To him, the kindness he extended had been as natural as breathing, but to her it had been a lifeline, a reminder of her own worth. The young server took a deep breath, steadying herself. "When you helped me earlier, I realized that maybe I don't have to be invisible. That maybe, one day, I can make people feel the way you made me feel tonight. I want to be that kind of person." The elderly man felt a warmth spread through him, a gentle pride that went beyond words. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, looking into her eyes with a wisdom that came from years of hard-won experience. "You already are that kind of person," he said softly. "You showed me kindness before you knew anything about me. That's true strength, and don't ever forget it." The young server smiled, a mixture of relief and inspiration lighting up her face. She gave a small nod, her heart lifted by his words. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. "I won't forget this. I'll carry it with me." She stepped back, allowing him to continue his journey, yet somehow feeling as if she'd been changed in ways she couldn't fully express. As she turned to re-enter the building, the elderly man watched her go, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He understood that for her, tonight had marked a turning point, a moment of self-recognition that would shape the path she walked. He knew all too well the power of such moments. After all, he had once been a young dreamer himself, someone whose own journey had begun with a spark of hope and the guidance of a few kind souls. He turned back to the quiet street, his footsteps steady as he moved forward, the cloth tucked safely in his pocket, a small token of gratitude, yet a symbol of the greater impact he had left behind. His thoughts drifted back to the hall, to the guests who had come expecting nothing more than an evening of grandeur and opulence, only to find themselves on an unexpected journey of self-reflection and growth. He knew they would wake up the next morning changed, even if only in the smallest of ways. Some would find themselves pausing before judging others, recalling the humility he had shown them. Others would remember the kindness and understanding he extended without expectation. As he walked further, he reflected on the many lessons life had taught him, lessons that had shaped him into the person he was today. He thought of the countless times he had been overlooked, underestimated, his worth measured only by his outward appearance, and yet those experiences had become the foundation of his character, a source of strength that no wealth could ever replace. He had learned that true richness came not from what one acquired, but from what one gave, and tonight had reminded him of the quiet power that came from sharing that richness with others. Lost in thought, he eventually reached a small park at the edge of the street, its benches empty under the dim glow of a street lamp. He took a seat, feeling the cool metal beneath him, and gazed out over the quiet surroundings. The stillness of the night was comforting, a gentle reminder that even in a bustling world, peace could be found in the simplest of moments. Sitting there, he let himself reflect on the evening, his heart filled with a quiet pride, not for what he owned, but for the lives he had touched. The lessons he had shared would continue to ripple out, influencing lives in ways he might never see. Yet he felt content in knowing he had left a part of himself with each person he had encountered. In that moment, he realized that his legacy was not the building he owned or the wealth he had accumulated, but the values he had imparted to others, the small yet profound ways he had inspired change. He sat there, immersed in the quiet, his heart at peace, knowing he had lived a life that mattered, not by the world's standards but by his own. And as the stars shone down upon him, he felt a sense of fulfillment that words could never capture, a contentment that came only from a life truly well lived. As the elderly man sat quietly in the park, the night stretched around him, peaceful and still. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool air, letting the calmness settle deeply within him. It was in these quiet moments that he often found himself reflecting on the journey he had traveled, a journey that had been neither easy nor straightforward, yet one that had shaped him with invaluable lessons. Each memory felt like a chapter etched into his soul, carrying with it a message, a reminder of what truly mattered. Just as he was about to rise, footsteps echoed softly behind him. He turned to see an unexpected figure approaching, a middle-aged man, well-dressed but without the pretension he had seen in the crowd earlier. The man paused, his hands in his pockets, his expression one of quiet respect. "I hope I'm not intruding," the man said, his voice low and filled with genuine reverence. "I saw you leave and, well, I felt I needed to speak with you before the night ended." The elderly man offered a warm smile, gesturing for the man to sit beside him on the bench. "You're not intruding at all," he replied gently. "Please, join me." The man took a seat, his posture slightly tense as though carrying the weight of words that had been long withheld. After a pause, he spoke, his tone laced with a mix of admiration and guilt. "I was at the gala tonight," he began, his gaze fixed on the ground. "And well, like many others, I made judgments before knowing anything about you. I've spent so many years in circles where wealth and appearances meant everything. But tonight, you reminded me of something I had almost forgotten." He looked up, his eyes meeting the elderly man's, sincere and open. "You reminded me that success isn't about what we have, but who we are. And it's about what we do with the power we've been given. I can't say I've always used that power well." The elderly man listened intently, his expression understanding, encouraging the man to continue. "I used to be different," the man admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I used to care about people, used to believe in something bigger than myself. But somewhere along the way, I got lost. I got so caught up in keeping up with everyone else that I forgot the things that really mattered." He paused, a faint sadness in his eyes. "Tonight, I saw something in you that brought it all back. Your presence. The way you moved through that room without a trace of pride. It made me realize how much I've changed, and not for the better." The elderly man nodded slowly, his eyes soft with empathy. He knew the path the man described all too well. He, too, had faced temptations of wealth, moments when he could have abandoned his values for the allure of status. But he had found his way, and now he was watching another man begin the journey back to himself. "It's easy to lose sight of what's important," the elderly man said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that reassured rather than judged. "We're often taught that success means rising above others, standing out in a crowd. But real success is found in humility, in knowing that our worth isn't measured by what others see, but by what we feel here." He placed a hand over his heart, his gaze unwavering. The man nodded, absorbing his words, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said after a moment, his voice choked with emotion. "You've given me a gift tonight, something I don't think I can repay." The elderly man smiled, shaking his head slightly. "The only repayment I could ever want is for you to live those lessons. Carry them forward, share them with others. That's how we leave something meaningful behind." The man looked down, visibly moved. "I will," he promised softly. "I don't know where to begin, but I want to change. I want to become someone who can look back and feel proud, someone who can give back to the world like you have." The elderly man nodded, his heart full, knowing that this small conversation had planted a seed. Change, he knew, started with a single step, a single decision. And tonight this man had taken that step. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet night stretching around them, both men sharing an understanding that needed no further words. Finally, the man rose, extending his hand with a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for reminding me of who I want to be." The elderly man accepted his handshake with a warm smile. "It's never too late," he replied softly, his words carrying the weight of truth. "Just remember to walk your path with kindness, and the rest will follow." With one last nod, the man turned and disappeared into the night, his steps lighter, his spirit renewed. The elderly man watched him go, a quiet satisfaction in his heart. He knew that he might never see this man again, but he also knew that a piece of him would live on in every choice that man made, every life he touched. The elderly man sat back on the bench, gazing once more at the stars above. He felt a deep peace settle over him, a quiet joy that was born not from wealth or recognition, but from the knowledge that he had given something of himself to others, that he had left a lasting imprint on the lives around him. The night stretched on, calm and serene, and as he closed his eyes to breathe in the silence, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The night deepened around him, and the park became even quieter, with only the distant sounds of the city humming softly in the background. The elderly man remained on the bench, wrapped in the stillness, each moment a gentle echo of the night's events. He felt a profound peace settle over him, knowing that tonight had been more than just a gathering. It had been a convergence of stories, lives, and lessons, a reminder of what truly connected people. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted to memories of his own past, his journey from hardship to success, the sacrifices and the choices that had shaped him. He recalled the people who had shown him kindness when he had nothing, those who had believed in him even when the world had dismissed him. He remembered the quiet promises he had made to himself, to always remain humble, to never let his success overshadow his humanity, to use his blessings as a means to lift others. Tonight he had honored those promises, and he felt their weight and warmth in his heart. Just as he was lost in his reflections, he became aware of another presence nearby. A young woman had approached, her steps hesitant yet deliberate. She looked somewhat familiar, perhaps one of the guests from the gala, but she seemed different now. Her face softened, her gaze reflective. She paused a few feet away, her eyes meeting his with a quiet reverence. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said gently, her voice respectful, as though she understood the sanctity of the moment. I couldn't leave without saying thank you." The elderly man smiled, motioning for her to sit beside him if she wished. She accepted the invitation, settling onto the bench beside him, her posture both grateful and contemplative. "I was one of those people," she admitted softly, her voice carrying a tinge of regret. "One of those people who judged you the moment I saw you. I thought I knew everything I needed to know just by looking at you. But tonight you showed me how wrong I was." He listened quietly, allowing her to express the thoughts that weighed on her. She paused, gathering her emotions, and continued. "It's so easy to get caught up in appearances, in status, in the things that don't really matter. I've spent so long trying to fit into that world, to prove myself by those standards. But tonight, you reminded me that there's so much more to life. You've reminded me that real worth has nothing to do with how others see you, but with how you treat them." Her words resonated deeply, carrying the sincerity of someone who had experienced a revelation. The elderly man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes kind and understanding. "We all have moments when we forget what truly matters," he said. "What's important is that we find our way back. Life has a way of reminding us, often when we least expect it." The young woman nodded, her eyes misty with emotion. "I want to live differently," she whispered almost to herself. "I want to live with the kindness and humility I saw in you tonight. I want to be someone who lifts others up, not just someone who seeks her own gain." The elderly man smiled warmly, his heart swelling with pride. "You have that power within you," he told her, his voice steady and full of conviction. You just have to trust in it and let it guide you. There's no greater gift you can give to the world than your true, compassionate self." They sat together in comfortable silence, the young woman absorbing his words as if they were a balm for her soul. The quiet of the night enveloped them, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the whole world had stilled, holding its breath in honor of the profound simplicity of the connection they shared. After a while, the young woman rose, a gentle strength in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "I will carry your words with me, and I will do my best to honor them." The elderly man nodded, watching her with a sense of fulfillment. "Take care," he said softly, "and remember, each step you take, however small, will shape the path ahead. Walk it with grace and you'll find your way." With one last nod, the young woman turned and disappeared into the night, her steps purposeful and light, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The elderly man watched her go, feeling a quiet satisfaction that went beyond words. Tonight had been more than just a chance encounter. It had been a chance to pass on the wisdom he had gathered over a lifetime, a chance to spark change in another heart. As the silence returned, he felt a deep contentment, knowing that he had given something of himself that would live on. For him, this was the greatest gift, the knowledge that his life, his choices, and his kindness had made a difference, even if only in the lives of a few. And as he sat in the quiet night, he felt a profound peace, a sense of completion that filled his heart with an unshakable joy. As the young woman's figure disappeared into the shadows, the elderly man remained seated, feeling the fullness of the night settling around him, each moment a reminder of the simplicity and depth of human connection. He leaned back on the bench, the weight of years balanced by the lightness of knowing he had lived a life that touched others. His thoughts wandered to the many faces he had seen that evening, each guest at the gala who had entered with one intention and left with another, each heart a little softer, each perspective a little broader. He thought of the young server who had gifted him the cloth, the businessman who had admitted his regret, the woman who had judged him only to find humility and apology, and the guests who had each approached him with a need to share, to understand, to be forgiven. Every interaction felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, each one adding to the fabric of an evening that had become a testament to the hidden goodness in people, waiting only to be awakened. He remembered his own mentors, the people who had lifted him when he was young and struggling, those who had shown him the value of integrity and compassion when he had nothing to offer in return. In a way, he felt he had come full circle, passing on the same kindnesses and lessons that had once been bestowed upon him. The street remained quiet, the stars flickering faintly overhead, casting a gentle light across the empty park. For a moment he felt the passage of time acutely, the years that had passed, the moments that had shaped him, and the wisdom he had gathered. It all seemed to culminate here, on this silent night, his heart full, his soul at peace. Just then, a soft sound drew his attention. The park gates creaked open, and a figure stepped through, a young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, wearing a simple hoodie and sneakers that looked a little too big for his feet. He seemed hesitant, almost as if he hadn't expected to see anyone else there. The boy's gaze met the elderly man's, and he froze, uncertain. The elderly man offered a gentle smile, gesturing for him to come closer. "Out for a late walk?" he asked softly, his tone kind and welcoming. The boy approached slowly, his eyes wary yet curious. "Yeah," he replied after a moment, his voice quiet. "Couldn't sleep. Sometimes I come here. Just to think, you know." The elderly man nodded, understanding. "It's a good place for that," he said. "There's something about the stillness of the night that lets us see things a bit more clearly." The boy seemed to relax, taking a seat on the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet settling comfortably between them. Finally the boy spoke, his voice laced with a hint of frustration. "Sometimes it feels like no one really understands. Like, people only see what they want to see, and they don't really care about who you are." The elderly man listened intently, recognizing the familiar pang in the boy's words, the feeling of invisibility, of being misunderstood. He thought back to his own youth, to the times he had felt lost, defined only by what others assumed of him. "I understand," he said gently. "People can be quick to judge. They see a piece of us and think it's the whole story. But what matters is that you don't lose sight of who you are, even if others can't see it yet." The boy glanced at him, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Did people judge you too?" The elderly man chuckled softly, nodding. "Oh, many times. They saw what they wanted to see, but they didn't know what was in my heart. And it's taken me a lifetime to realize that what others see doesn't define me. Only my actions do." The boy seemed to absorb his words, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. I guess that makes sense. I don't want to be invisible." The elderly man's gaze softened, seeing himself in the young boy's eyes. "You're not invisible," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "People may overlook you now, but someday they'll see the strength that's inside you. And if you hold on to that, if you stay true to yourself, you'll find that you don't need their approval to be who you are." They sat in silence again, the boy nodding slightly, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. For a moment they were simply two souls, bridging the distance between age and youth, sharing a connection born of experience and understanding. The boy finally stood, a small, grateful smile on his face. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice sincere. I think I needed to hear that." The elderly man nodded, watching him go, his heart swelling with a gentle pride. He knew the boy would carry that moment with him, that his words would become a compass for a young soul searching for direction. He had planted a seed, and though he might never see it bloom, he felt a quiet certainty that it would grow. As the boy disappeared through the park gates, the elderly man rose from the bench, feeling the night settle around him like a familiar cloak. His work here was done, and as he took his first steps down the path, he felt the weight of the evening lift, replaced by a serene sense of purpose fulfilled. The stars above twinkled as though in approval, their light guiding his way as he walked back toward his life, his heart at ease, knowing he had left a part of himself with each soul he had touched. And as he disappeared into the quiet embrace of the night, he knew that his legacy would live on, not in buildings or riches, but in the hearts of those who had, even if just for a moment, seen the world through his eyes.